On the night of May 3, 2011, around 9 p.m., Xishan Square in Nanchong, China was at its busiest and most lively. Crowds of people walked back and forth, conversations and laughter filling the air. Then suddenly, a woman's terrified scream tore through the noise. "Kidnapping! Help!" The panicked cry made the crowd freeze for a moment. All eyes turned toward the source of the sound, and what they saw left many unable to react. A middle-aged man was being surrounded from three sides by three muscular men wearing baseball caps. Their movements were extremely swift and cold, so decisive that they reminded onlookers of professionally trained agents from action movies. In that brief moment, one of the men suddenly pulled out a thin steel wire. Under the yellowish glow of the streetlights, the wire flashed with a cold glint before being wrapped tightly around the man's neck. The kidnapping victim, surnamed Li, was a notorious real estate tycoon in business circles, possessing assets worth hundreds of millions of yuan. Just seconds earlier, he had been leisurely strolling hand in hand across the square with his mistress Du Wen, looking completely relaxed. But Li had no idea that from that very moment, death had already set its sights on him. When the sudden attack came, Li froze for an instant before frantically struggling, screaming in desperation, "What are you doing?" But all his resistance proved meaningless. This man, who was used to giving orders at banquet tables and wielding power in business circles, was now pathetically helpless, easily subdued, as weak as a chick waiting to be slaughtered. His mistress Du Wen witnessed the scene and turned pale with terror. Despite the danger, she rushed forward trying to pull Li back, but before she could reach him, another man quickly locked his arm around her throat and violently threw her to the ground, leaving her sprawled out amid the shocked screams of the surrounding crowd. The entire incident took less than a minute. Before the bystanders could even understand what was happening, before anyone could react or intervene, Li had already been dragged into a black Citroën waiting by the roadside. The engine roared to life, and the car sped away, quickly disappearing from sight. In the middle of the square, all that remained was Du Wen's heart-wrenching, almost desperate sobbing, along with the stunned, bewildered gazes of passers-by standing frozen in place, none of them able to believe what had just happened before their eyes was real. The victim, Li, was no ordinary person. He was a wealthy tycoon with fame and status in the local area. But what was strange and most puzzling was that after this shocking kidnapping, the perpetrators remained completely silent. Not a single ransom call, not a word about money or any conditions for exchange. Li seemed to have evaporated from the face of the earth. No sign of him alive, no body found dead. Initially, police believed that someone being taken in broad daylight among such a crowd was likely the result of business conflicts or because he had offended someone. But as the truth gradually came to light, the final revelation sent chills down everyone's spine. The kidnapping victim, Li, was born in 1959 in a poor, remote mountain village in Zichang County. Looking back at his journey to success, it was truly a classic story of rising from the bottom of society through sweat, calculation, and daring. Li dropped out before finishing middle school, leaving home early to make a living. He was hard-working, unafraid of hardship, quick-witted, and especially skilled at winning people over and building relationships with those in power. Starting as a manual laborer hauling bricks and cement on construction sites, Li gradually accumulated experience and connections. Through his boldness, willingness to take risks, and talent for manipulating and commanding others, he rose step by step from a small contractor to a boss, eventually establishing his own real estate company. By 2006, Li's fortune had swelled to hundreds of millions, and his business card bore the title of Vice President of the Municipal Federation of Industry and Commerce. In Nanchong, the name Li was considered someone of importance, someone others treated with respect. However, money and status couldn't wash away the street-tough nature deeply ingrained in him. Li was hot-tempered, easily flew into rages, and could turn on people faster than flipping a page, always believing that whoever had the harder fist was right. In business, he was ruthless to the point of cruelty, willing to step on others to climb higher. In daily life, Li was also domineering, doing whatever he wanted, rarely considering others' feelings. His romantic life was even more chaotic and complicated. Before meeting his current wife, Eulin, Li had already gone through 3 marriages and just as many divorces. Rumors about his wild lifestyle and affairs with one woman after another never stopped. Li was wealthy and placed enormous importance on appearances. Despite having money and power in hand, he always harbored an inferiority complex about his lack of education. The less he had in that regard, the more he yearned to break into high society, to sit at the same table with people who had education and status. That's why he understood very clearly that he needed a wife not just to live with, but to serve as his face, a prestigious signboard for his identity, a woman with culture and social reputation enough to compensate for his own shortcomings. And Eulin, seemingly perfect in all these aspects, quickly caught Li's attention. Eulin was born in 1964 in Yilong, Sichuan province, into a standard intellectual family. Her father had been the head of the local supply and marketing cooperative, her mother was an elementary school teacher, and she had 2 older brothers. As the youngest daughter, Eulin had been pampered from childhood, her life almost always smooth sailing, rarely having to suffer any disadvantages. This environment gradually shaped in her a strong, competitive personality. She had to be first in everything, never allowing herself to be inferior to others. Eulin's academic achievements and credentials were truly impressive. In her very first year of teaching, she won a major award in the county-level math competition, quickly becoming a prominent figure in local education circles. However, Eulin was not content with spending her entire life as an elementary school teacher in a small town. She had greater ambitions. During the day she taught, and in the evenings she continued studying, earning a college degree while working, then passing the entrance exam for West China Normal University, persevering until she completed her master's degree. As her abilities grew, so did her opportunities. Eulin was quickly transferred from a rural school to teach at a key elementary school in downtown Nanchong. Relying on her capabilities and fierce determination in her work, she climbed step by step from an ordinary teacher to vice principal, and by 2005, she had firmly secured the position of principal at Renmin South Road Elementary School. In the eyes of colleagues and students, Eulin was a strict leader with a tough style and iron discipline. Her certificates and awards were so numerous they could cover an entire wall. Yet in complete contrast to her image as a strong, successful career woman, Eulin's married life had never been smooth. Her first marriage wasn't born from love, but was arranged by her parents in the traditional way. At just 20 years old, Eulin married a man named Qiao Tairen, an employee at her father's workplace. Qiao Tairen was a gentle, honest man with a mild temperament, rarely getting angry, and toward Eulin, he was nearly 100% patient and accommodating. After their daughter was born, Tairen took on even more of the household responsibilities, from cooking to childcare, all so his wife could focus on her career without worrying about matters at home. But in Eulin's eyes, a woman with ambitions higher than the sky, always yearning to rise, her husband's goodness and deference were not virtues at all. On the contrary, she saw them as signs of a man without drive, without ambition, and with nothing remarkable to make her proud. The higher Eulin's position rose and the greater her reputation in society became, the more she looked at her gentle husband and felt they were living in 2 completely different worlds. In daily life, Eulin could easily lose her temper after exchanging barely 3 sentences with her husband. She frequently berated and criticized him harshly over trivial matters. Qiao Tairen, with his patient and enduring nature, always chose to silently bear it, hoping his sacrifice would eventually earn her understanding. But sadly, his patience didn't soften Eulin's heart. It only deepened her contempt for him. Not long after their daughter was born, Eulin was diagnosed with breast cancer and had to undergo surgery to remove both breasts. For any woman, this would be an extremely painful ordeal, not only physically, but also a devastating psychological blow. But Eulin didn't collapse. On the contrary, the ordeal seemed to temper her, making her even more hardened. The physical imperfection made her inner self more sensitive and suspicious, but also colder and more resolute than before. And deep down, Eulin remained convinced that her gentle, ordinary husband was now completely unworthy of standing beside a woman like her. In 1999, Eulin initiated and pressured Qiao Tairen into divorce. In the separation, she took most of the family's assets and won direct custody of their daughter. However, fearing the impact on their daughter's education and psychological well-being, they chose to divorce on paper but not in practice. In front of others, they kept the divorce secret, continuing to live together under the same roof like a normal family. Xiao Tairen still harbored feelings for his former wife and made several attempts to reconcile, hoping to restore their marriage. But all his efforts were met with Eulin's coldness and finality. To completely extinguish any hope he might have, Eulin even made a cruel decision. She changed their daughter's surname from Qiao to Yu, completely severing ties with the Qiao family. In truth, Eulin had long ago mapped out a plan for the second half of her life. She knew exactly what she wanted and made no effort to hide her ambitions. Once her daughter grew up, got into college, and left her care, she would start her life over on her own terms. The next man Eulin chose would have to be worthy, not just wealthy, but also possessing social status, enough to stand as her equal in both identity and reputation. That opportunity came during the National Day holiday in 2006. At that time, Eulin was 42 years old and Li was 47. Through a mutual acquaintance's matchmaking, they officially met. At that moment, both were standing at important crossroads in their lives. Eulin's daughter had just been accepted into a prestigious university, and the biggest burden in her heart was finally lifted. She could now wholeheartedly pursue the ideal partner she had always wanted. As for Li, his career was at its peak. He had plenty of money and more than enough reputation, but he lacked something very important: a respectable marriage to serve as the backdrop for his social image. He needed a wife with education and status, enough to help him gild his identity and step more firmly into the upper class. Two people, each carrying their own calculations, quickly recognized how suitable the other was. Not because of romantic love, but because of mutual interests and needs, the marriage between these two strong personalities was practically decided in a short time. In Eulin's eyes, Li seemed almost carved from the exact template of her ideal man. Although his education was an undeniable weakness, the fact that he had risen from nothing to build such an enormous enterprise, holding assets worth hundreds of millions, was in itself legendary enough to overshadow his lack of formal learning. Most importantly, Li had both money and status, perfectly meeting the practical criteria Eulin had set for the second half of her life. To show her frankness, and also as a way to test his reaction, Eulin laid her cards on the table from the start. She didn't hide her painful past, speaking directly about having had breast cancer surgery and that her body was imperfect, no longer whole like a normal person. Eulin had thought this would be an important test, even mentally preparing herself for hesitant looks or awkwardness from Li, but his reaction was completely unexpected. After hearing everything, Li showed no surprise whatsoever. Instead, he laughed heartily and spoke at length with complete ease, making Eulin's heart bloom with joy. He said casually, "At this age, it's not like we're having children. Whatever's lacking with the body really isn't worth worrying about. I didn't read many books. If I get to be with someone cultured like you, I can learn a thing or two. That'll only help with doing bigger business in the future." Those seemingly simple words struck right at Eulin's heart. She felt the man before her wasn't shallow at all. On the contrary, he was practical, had vision, and could see the big picture. In that moment, Eulin believed this was the man she could bet the rest of her life on. But Eulin had no idea that behind that hearty laugh, Li's mind was calculating more shrewdly than anyone. In truth, he had already quietly investigated Eulin's background very thoroughly. A female principal of a prestigious school with a master's degree, just bringing her out in public would be enough to boost his image. Her identity alone was an invaluable signboard. But what caught Li's attention even more wasn't just Eulin's education or position, it was the connections behind her. Both of Eulin's older brothers held important positions in government. With such backing, it was like having two great mountains to lean on in his future business dealings. In Li's eyes, this marriage wasn't just about husband and wife, it was an extremely worthwhile investment. Because of these calculations, The two had known each other for less than a month before rushing into marriage, so quickly that many around them were startled. Eulin's close friends did try to warn her. One pulled her aside and frankly pointed out Li's problems one by one: his womanizing, his volatile temper, his tendency to turn on people, and the fact that he had already been divorced 3 times. The friend sincerely advised, "With your strong personality, living with him will definitely not be peaceful." But at that time, Eulin's head was filled only with rosy dreams of marrying into wealth, of stepping up to a higher level of life. Those frank words couldn't get through to her. On the contrary, Eulin thought her friends were just jealous. On November 4th, 2006, Li and Eulin's wedding was held with great fanfare, so spectacular it shook the entire city of Nanchong. Nearly everyone who was anyone in business, government, and education circles showed up, making the ceremony seem like a major social event. The local television host continuously used flowery language to praise them, calling it a union of noble houses, a combination of strength with strength, wealth joining hands with learning, power walking alongside reputation. Under the brilliant stage lights, amid countless admiring gazes, Li held Eulin tightly and addressed all the guests. He loudly proclaimed, "Marrying Eulin is the blessing of several lifetimes. From now on, I will spend my whole life as her elementary school student." The moment those words were spoken, the entire hall burst into applause, pushing the couple's image to the pinnacle of admiration. After the marriage, Eulin felt like she was walking on clouds. Her heart was filled with satisfaction, believing that all the humiliation, frustration, and sacrifice of the first half of her life had finally been repaid in that moment. The early period after the wedding was indeed sweet. Li had a villa of over 2,100 square feet lavishly decorated, as magnificent as a gilded palace, making it their shared home. Eulin also showed great generosity, contributing several $100,000 so Li could add some money to buy a BMW 730 with the lucky license plate number 58888, considering it her dowry for this seemingly perfect marriage. But as the glamorous veneer of the honeymoon phase gradually peeled away, the marriage could no longer maintain its original beauty. The true natures of both began to emerge. Li and Eulin were both strong personalities accustomed to standing in positions of authority, more used to giving orders than listening, so neither would bow to the other. Living under the same roof, these two were literally like the tip of a needle meeting the point of wheat. The slightest contact sparked fire. Eulin gradually realized that deep in his bones, Li was still the contractor he'd always been. Crude language, blunt speech, volatile temper, and accustomed to using pressure to dominate others. Conversely, Li soon understood that the educated woman he'd married was nothing like the gentle, virtuous flower he had imagined. Before him stood a fierce, unyielding woman, strong as a tigress, hungry to control everything, insisting on having a hand in every matter large or small, refusing to lose at anything. In this tug of war, Eulin was the one who adapted her thinking faster. She told herself that she had already boarded this ship. There was no turning back. Rather than thinking about retreat, she chose to advance, treating this marriage as a battle she had to win. Eulin believed that as long as she devoted all her efforts to helping her husband succeed, her position as a wife would grow increasingly secure. The more Li's career prospered, the more her own value would be affirmed, and the more her face would shine before the world. Because of this thinking, Eulin began mobilizing all the connections she had accumulated over the years, quietly working behind the scenes to clear the path and pave the way for her husband's business dealings, gradually transforming herself into an indispensable power base behind Li's career. By 2009, thanks to Eulin's backing and connections, Li secured a large-scale real estate project in Sichong County. But when construction was only halfway complete, disaster struck. Li's company suddenly experienced a cash flow crisis, unable to turn over capital in time. To save her husband, and also to save the gamble she herself had placed, Eulin went all in. She not only withdrew her entire life savings of 1.2 million yuan, approximately $185,000, but also swallowed her pride and ran around borrowing another 1.4 million yuan, approximately $215,000, from relatives and friends. In the end, she scraped together 2.6 million yuan, approximately $400,000, and poured it all into the project without hesitation, essentially emptying her own coffers. But immediately after that enormous sum of money was transferred, Eulin did something she would deeply regret, a decision that was essentially planting a ticking time bomb in her own marriage. After all, she was an educated person, and in her mind, money matters should be clear and straightforward. Even between blood siblings, things should be transparent, let alone between husband and wife. There could be no ambiguity. Therefore, she directly demanded that Li write her an IOU. The moment Li heard this, the smile on his face instantly froze. Though unhappy inside, he forced himself to stay patient, saying that since they were family, why divide things so clearly? But Eulin was already heated and refused to back down. To pressure her husband, she even lied, claiming she had set up a dual control mechanism at the bank, and without an IOU, the money couldn't be withdrawn. Pushed into a corner with no other choice, Li's face darkened as he wrote out 2 I owe us. But Li was no fool either. After the incident, he quietly went to the bank to inquire and quickly discovered the truth. There was no such loan or dual control mechanism that Eulin had described. In that moment, the grudge in Li's heart was permanently sealed. In his mind, the person standing before him was no longer his wife. She was a business partner, and moreover, a partner who was always on guard, ready to suspect and calculate against him at any moment. Time passed to 2008 and the real estate market picked up. The project began selling well and cash flow returned. At this point, Li took the initiative to repay the full 1.4 million yuan, approximately $215,000, he had borrowed from relatives and friends outside the family. But regarding Eulin's 1.2 million yuan, approximately $185,000, he didn't say a single word. Eulin couldn't hold back any longer and finally demanded her money directly, but the answer she received was like a bucket of ice water poured straight over her head, chilling her to the bone. Li put on an infuriatingly innocent expression and calmly said, "We're family. What reason is there to pay back money? Besides, the company's books are showing losses right now. Where would I get money to pay you back?" Eulin immediately exploded with rage, shouting, "Who do you think you're fooling? I teach math. You think I can't figure out these accounts?" But Li only responded coldly with a single sentence. "Believe it or not, that's up to you." Just those words were enough to leave Eulin speechless, frozen on the spot. From that day forward, the house that had once been called a home officially became a battlefield. Eulin hounded her husband every day demanding money, while Li played the shameless game every day, dodging, evading, wiping his hands of all responsibility. The fighting dragged on until Li's hidden thug-like nature finally revealed itself completely. He turned to threatening Eulin, declaring that he held evidence of her corruption and bribery during her time as principal. Not only that, Li spewed vicious words that if she continued making a big deal of things, he would drag both of her government official brothers down with her. Not long after, Li simply moved out, not even bothering to come home once in half a month. This marriage in name only quickly became an empty shell, without any warmth or bond left. Eulin was so furious she couldn't stand it any longer and finally went to court to file for divorce. But the court's investigation dealt her a fatal blow. Li's company accounts not only had no money, they were drowning in debt. Only then did Eulin truly wake up. Li had long since transferred all the assets away, digging a deep pit just for her. Now, if she chose to divorce, she wouldn't get a single cent. She would even have to shoulder that 1.2 million yuan, approximately $185,000, herself. Eulin immediately confronted Li to settle things. In front of her, Li appeared quite relaxed, agreeing to divorce. But the condition he offered made one choke with indignation. He would only give Eulin 1 million yuan, approximately $154,000, not even enough to cover the principal she had originally invested. It was nothing less than naked humiliation, with no attempt to hide it. Eulin naturally couldn't accept, and so the two fell into a prolonged deadlock. The divorce couldn't go through, yet continuing to live together was impossible. Each passing day was both painful and hopeless, with no way out. Right at this most tense moment, Eulin heard news that was like a knife stabbing straight into her heart. Her husband Lee was having an affair with a young, beautiful salesgirl right in his own company. This information was like salt rubbed into Eulin's already wounded heart. The fury and jealousy caused her to gradually lose her reason, and she began acting like a detective, secretly following and stalking her husband, hoping to catch him red-handed to vent the resentment in her heart. But time after time, she failed. Until the night of May 29th, 2009, when a completely unexpected discovery ignited the real war. That evening, Eulin visited her mother's home. When she went downstairs, she suddenly spotted Lee's BMW parked there. What made her freeze was that the car wasn't locked, and the key was still in the ignition. In that moment, when her anger shot straight to her head, Eulin had a thought. You won't pay your debt? Then I'll drive this car away as payment. Without hesitation, she got in, stepped on the gas, and drove off. But right there in that car, Eulin discovered something that pushed everything beyond her limits of endurance. A love letter 5 pages long, filled with sickeningly sweet and intimate words. When Lee discovered his car was missing, he immediately checked the surveillance cameras and quickly saw that Eulin had driven it away. In a rage fueled by alcohol, he lost nearly all control and stormed to the gates of Renmin South Road Elementary School. There, Lee kicked and pounded on the iron gates in the dead of night, screaming without stop, "Eulin, you thief! Get out here!" In just one night, the scandal spread throughout the city of Nanchong. Everyone knew that the principal of a prestigious school and her billionaire husband were having a violent falling out. Not just arguing, but arguing in an utterly disgraceful way. For Eulin, who valued her reputation more than her life, this scene was nothing less than being dragged out for public execution before the entire world. Afterward, the two continued their battle over the house. They threw themselves into a bizarre lock-changing war. One side would break in, and the other would change the lock, back and forth 5 or 6 times. Finally, Lee called the police to intervene. When the police arrived, they determined the house was Lee's premarital property, and therefore ruled that Eulin was no longer allowed to enter. Blocked by police and security guards from the front door of the house once called home, Eulin completely collapsed. Money was gone, feelings were shattered, and now even the thing she valued most, her reputation, was lost. These 3 mountains crashed down all at once, crushing completely the woman who had once been seen as invincible. The look in Eulin's eyes as she gazed at Lee was no longer one of resentment or pain. It was cold like ice blades, so sharp that even a touch would make one shudder. In her mind, more than once arose a terrifying thought. If this man could completely disappear from the world, how much lighter everything would feel. That thought was fleeting at first, but as the days of being cornered continued, it gradually took root, growing silently in her heart. Right when Eulin was sinking deepest into hatred, loathing her husband to the extreme, a man unexpectedly entered her life, an unforeseen variable no one could have predicted. His name was Bu Yijia. In July 2009, they met at a friend's birthday party. Yijia was of Tibetan ethnicity, tall and well-built, with masculine energy that was impossible to hide. He was 7 years younger than Eulin, yet carried a very different kind of worldliness. He had been a special forces soldier, had won championships in Sanda, Chinese kickboxing, and after leaving the military worked in construction in Nanchong. His physique was solid, with broad shoulders and a thick back, even sporting 6-pack abs, the kind of man who could make others feel his strength and masculinity just by standing still. That evening, Yijia showed particular enthusiasm for the melancholy beautiful female principal. One sister Yu after another, he called out to her sweetly and intimately, making no effort to hide his attention. For Eulin, who had fallen to the very bottom of her life, that warmth was like a rare bit of heat in the middle of a cold winter, causing her heart to stir after so many numb days. A few days later, Yijia took the initiative to ask Eulin out for tea. In that quiet setting, Eulin poured out for the first time all the grievances, chaos, and pain she had endured in her marriage with Lee. Yijia listened without missing a word, growing angrier the more he heard, cursing Lee without restraint, then continuously comforting Eulin. "A good woman like you truly doesn't deserve to suffer such injustice." Every word struck the deepest place in Eulin's heart. She gradually realized that just being around this man made her feel lighter, as if the fury inside her was somewhat soothed. After many meetings, the distance between them quickly dissolved, and their familiarity became increasingly natural. On a rainy day in August 2009, after dinner, in an emotionally confused state, Eulin half-accidentally, half-deliberately led Yijia into a hotel. One was a woman wounded to the bone by marriage, the other a man in the middle of separating from his girlfriend. In that moment of loneliness and weakness, the two quickly crossed the final boundary. In truth, from the very beginning, the relationship between them was never pure. For Eulin, Yijia wasn't simply a lover. He was like the last vine she was clutching in desperation, a tool to carry out her plan of revenge against the husband who had driven her to the edge. Deep down, Eulin had never forgotten the humiliation, pain, and loss that Lee had caused her, and she needed someone strong enough and reckless enough to do what she herself couldn't do directly. For Yijia, everything was much simpler. In his eyes, Eulin was a woman of culture and status, experienced and possessing a mature allure very different from young girls. Her authority and the fragility hidden beneath her tough exterior captivated Yijia to the point of losing his direction, falling into a blind state he himself didn't even recognize. In the quiet of late nights, Eulin would lie beside Yijia's pillow, her voice soft as a whisper. Again and again, she would tearfully recount how badly her husband had treated her, how he had secretly transferred assets, how he had made her lose all face before the world. In Eulin's telling, she transformed herself into an absolute victim, cornered, betrayed, with nowhere left to live. Yijia occasionally tried to hold on to some rationality, advising her to pursue legal channels. But each time, Eulin would sob uncontrollably, saying that litigation would get her nothing, and Lee would only turn around and bite back, completely destroying her career and her life. Then, through her tear-filled eyes, Eulin would look up at Yijia, her voice both soft and haunting, and quietly drop a single line. If Lee could completely disappear, then his hundreds of millions in assets, wouldn't they belong to us? That statement was like a curse, hovering around Yijia's ears day after day, impossible to shake off. Every time he looked at Eulin growing thinner in his arms, her eyes increasingly exhausted and melancholy, a mix of emotions would surge within him, pity, infatuation, and a protective instinct magnified to the extreme. Gradually, Yijia convinced himself that someone like Lee, cold, ruthless, squeezing people dry and then trampling on them, deserved to be punished. On a day during the spring festival of 2010, after being intimate, Eulin collapsed on Yijia's chest, crying like a river. The tears were no longer restrained, they were desperation bursting forth. She choked out the words that as long as Lee lived another day, she wouldn't have a single day of peace. Her entire life would be weighed down by that ghost. In that very moment, Yijia made his decision. He held Eulin tightly, his voice dropping low, full of certainty. "Sister Yu, don't cry anymore. Let me handle him for you. You don't need to worry about anything. Just take me to identify who he is. Later, even if everything comes to light, I absolutely won't give you up." Those words were like an oath in the darkness. A criminal conspiracy, without the need for lengthy discussion, reached its terrifying consensus just like that. Eulin was silent for a few seconds, then slowly pulled a photo of Lee from her bag and placed it in Yijia's hands. It was no longer the image of a husband. It was a target. The next day, Eulin personally took Yijia on a reconnaissance mission, pointing out where Lee lived, the car he usually drove, the familiar routes he took coming and going. Along the way, looking at the high-rise buildings Lee had built standing tall throughout the city, Eulin's mind continued its cold calculations. This project alone, if sold completely, would profit at least 30 million yuan, approximately $4.6 million. Meanwhile, Yijia began secretly searching for someone to carry out the deed. First, he contacted a former comrade-in-arms in Guangdong who claimed to be a professional hitman, someone who had done dirty work without leaving traces. The two had quite in-depth discussions, even getting down to methods of action. But right at that moment, the school where Eulin served as principal ran into some internal problems. Fearing the complications might implicate her, and even more afraid of the plan being exposed, she reluctantly told Yijia to put everything on hold. After that failed attempt, Yijia didn't give up. He turned to his own nephew, wanting to pull him into following Li, at least to learn his daily patterns. But the nephew was timid by nature. The moment he heard the words, "kill someone," his legs went weak, his face turned pale, and no matter what Yijia said, he absolutely refused to get involved. 2 consecutive failures made Eulin increasingly impatient. As time passed, the hatred inside her didn't diminish. It fermented even more violently. In early April 2010, Yijia happened to meet a thug named Bai Chengtao while sitting in a tea house. This man had a criminal record, having just gotten out of prison not long before. After his so-called reform, he gathered a gang of underlings specializing in illegal work, from debt collection to assault. Anything with money attached he was willing to do. Yijia immediately recognized him as the type of person he needed. He pulled Bai Chengtao aside, lowered his voice, spoke directly, and offered 300,000 yuan, approximately $46,000, to take care of someone. The moment Chengtao heard that number, his eyes lit up green like a hungry wolf seeing prey. He thumped his chest, laughed heartily, and agreed without a moment's hesitation. Yijia gave Chengtao a photo of Li, along with the license plate number of the car he usually drove. Once Chengtao received this material, he immediately led his underlings to begin following the target. In no time, they had figured out Li's daily patterns. Every evening, he would frequently drive his mistress Duwen to a familiar tea house to play mahjong, sometimes staying until very late before returning home. When Yijia reported back, Eulin not only didn't stop them, she insisted on seeing for herself what kind of person this other woman was. Her curiosity didn't come from mere interest, but from jealousy and hatred that had been suppressed for too long. Late that night, Yijia drove Eulin to the area outside the tea house. The two sat in the car with the lights off, silently waiting. Before long, the tea house door opened. Under the streetlights, Duwen emerged, young, beautiful, with a graceful figure, arm in arm with Li, talking and laughing intimately. In that moment, all of Eulin's restraint completely collapsed. The flames of jealousy and resentment erupted violently, burning away the last shred of rationality she had left. With eyes terrifyingly cold, she turned and urged Yijia to act immediately. Afterward, Yijia gave Chengtao an advance of 20,000 yuan, approximately $3,100, telling him to immediately buy a beat-up old Citroën and to prepare shovels, machetes, and other necessary tools. The plan was laid out very clearly. First, they would go to the remote mountains of Chengtao's hometown in Jialing district, dig a pit in advance, wait for the right moment to strike, kidnap the target and take him straight to the mountain, then bury him alive, making him disappear without a trace. All preparations were gradually completed. To add more hands, Chengtao also called in 3 trusted underlings, Ren Guangming, Ren Hailin, and Du Jintao. Of course, he didn't dare tell them the truth, that this was murder. He only vaguely said they were helping the boss escort someone far away, and once the job was done, everyone would get paid. All 3 heard there was money involved, nodded in agreement, and asked no further questions. Actually, at the end of April, the group had already attempted to act once. That day, they staked out the tea house, patiently waiting for Li to emerge. But unexpectedly, that evening, Li didn't come alone. He brought along a whole group of friends, too many people and too many vehicles, creating too much commotion. Chengtao had no choice but to let the opportunity pass. Time dragged on, making both Eulin and Yijia increasingly anxious. Finally, on the afternoon of May 3rd, Yijia couldn't wait any longer. He called Cheng Tao directly and issued an ultimatum. Tonight, it must be done. Around 8 p.m. that evening, Cheng Tao led his 3 underlings, having just finished attending a friend's birthday party. Before the alcohol had even worn off, they got in the car and headed to work. They quickly switched to fake license plates they had prepared in advance, then drove around the busy streets looking for their target. It didn't take long before they spotted Li's pickup truck. After dinner, Li and his mistress Du Wen were leisurely strolling through Sishan Square. Hand in hand, completely absorbed in their private moment, they had no idea that just a few yards away, 4 men in baseball caps were scattered about, standing quietly, their cold eyes watching them like a pack of wolves stalking prey. About 15 minutes passed before Du Wen suddenly felt uneasy, as if something wasn't right. She gently tugged Li's hand, urging him to head back toward their car parked nearby. But that belated alertness was already meaningless. When the two were just a few steps from the car, a thug charged straight at them from the front, grabbing Li firmly before he could react. Almost simultaneously, another closed in from behind, and a cold steel wire was immediately wrapped tightly around Li's neck. Du Wen screamed in terror, rushing forward to pull him back, but all she received was a brutal kick that sent her whole body flying, sprawling onto the ground. The 3 remaining thugs coordinated smoothly, their movements swift and unhesitating. In less than a minute, Li had been shoved into the waiting Citroën. Inside the car, racing through the night, they immediately wrapped tape tightly around Li's mouth, preventing him from calling for help. Li panicked, kicking wildly, his body desperately struggling. Seeing the situation might get out of control, one of them pulled out a knife and without hesitation stabbed Li twice in the legs. The intense pain that hit him made him scream into his throat before quickly going limp, no longer able to resist. Halfway through the journey, Cheng Tao took out his phone and called Yijia, both to report that the target had been captured and to urge him to deliver money and prepare a vehicle for backup. Yijia immediately handed over another 20,000 won, approximately $3,100, but deliberately lied that he couldn't borrow a car, then quickly cut off contact, pretending he was no longer involved. Unexpectedly, right at that moment, the beat-up old Citroën actually broke down in the middle of the road. Cheng Tao was both furious and panicked, with no choice but to call Yijia back. After some scrambling, Yijia finally managed to get another vehicle. The whole group frantically carried Li, now half dead, transferred him to the new car, and continued racing toward the desolate mountains. Around midnight, the car carrying them turned onto a pitch-dark mountain road with not a single light around. But it wasn't until 2 a.m., in the thick darkness, that they finally fumbled their way to the pit that had been dug in advance. Li was dragged out of the car and thrown hard onto the ground. The pain startled him awake. The moment he opened his eyes, before him was a deep, black pit. Survival instinct surged up in that final moment, and Li summoned every last bit of strength he had, struggling to prop himself up, staggering as he tried to run and escape. Right then, Cheng Tao picked up a large rock and, without a word, raised it high and smashed it down. Li's body collapsed, no longer moving. The 3 remaining men immediately crowded in, dragging him down into the pit. Shovel after shovel, the cold yellow earth came down, burying not just one life, but an entire chain of horrifying crimes. To cover their tracks, they even deliberately planted a small tree on top, making it look as if nothing had ever happened. After everything was done, the whole group silently disappeared into the night. The moment the case of the Tycoon being kidnapped in broad daylight broke, all of Nanchong was shaken. The city police immediately formed a special task force. The case quickly had a breakthrough. On May 4th, the abandoned Citroën was discovered. Police traced the used car information and immediately identified the buyer as Bai Cheng Tao. On May 6th, police caught Cheng Tao watching TV in a rental room along with 2 of his underlings, Ren Guangming and Du Jintao. Yijia was also quickly named. They even led police to the location where Li's body was buried. After committing the crime, Yijia initially panicked and fled to Chengdu, thinking that getting far from the scene would mean escape. But his recklessness and greed caused him to increasingly lose control. Not long after, he was even bold enough to return to Nanchong to find Eulin and demand more money. By this time, Eulin had vaguely sensed the danger. She no longer dared to meet him in person, instead having someone else deliver another 20,000 yuan, approximately $3,100, to Yijia, coldly urging him to leave quickly, the farther the better. With no other choice, Yijia drove through the night to flee to Guizhou, temporarily hiding at the home of a former comrade in arms. But he had no idea that in the age of information technology, every call he made, every phone signal he sent, had long been quietly tracked by police. On the afternoon of May 18th, around 5 p.m., by the banks of the Wu River in Guizhou, Yijia sat leisurely fishing, holding his rod in one hand while calling Eulin on the phone, his voice full of longing and affection. On the other end of the line, Eulin tried to stay calm, speaking gently to soothe him, repeatedly reminding him that he absolutely must not give her up. Yijia immediately swore, saying that even if he died, he would never betray Sister Yu. But the moment he hung up the phone, several plainclothes police officers suddenly closed in from all directions, subduing him in a flash and pressing him firmly to the ground. Ironically, on the very day Yijia was arrested far away in Nanchong, Eulin was still continuing her final act. In front of her in-laws, she wept miserably, appearing devastated and grief-stricken over losing her husband, moving everyone who saw her. After successfully winning the trust and sympathy of her husband's family, Eulin immediately rushed to Xichang, summoned all of Li's company employees, and eagerly demanded that everyone hold a meeting to elect her as chairman of the board. But the chairman's seat she had dreamed of hadn't even warmed before retribution quietly arrived. 3 days later, on the morning of May 21st, Eulin was sitting in her office when the door suddenly opened. Officers from the special task force appeared before her. From a principal of a prestigious school, respected by all, Eulin became a suspect awaiting trial in the blink of an eye. The truth gradually came to light. After Yijia was arrested, he initially tried to shoulder all the blame himself, hoping he could protect Eulin. But those amateurish underworld tricks were no match for the seasoned investigators. After just a few rounds of interrogation, Yijia's psychological defenses completely collapsed. The mastermind behind everything, Eulin, was finally exposed. The news of the prestigious school's principal being arrested immediately shocked the entire city of Nanchong. No one could understand how a woman once seen as a model of success, intellect, and authority could have fallen to such a state. And the price to be paid wasn't just her freedom. It was the destruction of an entire family. Her daughter, studying for her master's degree in Shanghai, rushed home in tears upon hearing the terrible news, but wasn't even allowed to see her mother once. Eulin's elderly mother, over 70 years old and already frail, couldn't withstand the consecutive shocks and fell seriously ill. Not long after, the old woman passed away in bitter anguish. On December 29, 2011, the Intermediate People's Court of Nanchong City issued the first instance verdict. Defendants Eulin and Bai Chengtao were found guilty of intentional homicide and sentenced to death. Bu Yijia was sentenced to death with a 2-year reprieve. The 3 other accomplices also received various sentences. Eulin and Bai Chengtao refused to accept the verdict and appealed. On October 18, 2013, the Higher People's Court of Sichuan Province issued its final ruling. Chengtao's death sentence was upheld, while Eulin's death sentence was commuted to death with reprieve. The Supreme People's Court, after review, determined that Chengtao had directly carried out the killing in this case, was the organizer and executor, and his crimes were monstrous. He had to be severely punished. On October 11, 2014, a single gunshot rang out, bringing Chengtao's criminal life to an end. As for Eulin and Yijia, they will spend the rest of their lives in prison, paying for their crimes. And that is the case for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.